Welcome to another exciting edition of Blogging Heads. I'm one of your two hosts here, Ezra Klein, and I'm here with the legendary Mark Bittman. How's it going, Mark?
I'm feeling quite legendary. Thank you.
And you have a new book out, which is part of your vast legend. So what's the book?
The book is Food Matters. It's actually not so new, although it's coming out in paperback next month. So it'll
you have
be
a new paperback edition of your book
it'll
coming
be
out.
Renewed anyway, and it explores the link between overconsumption, overproduction of meat and junk food and processed food and obesity and global warming and destruction of the environment and just about everything else, except for perhaps the illiteracy rate.
And also it explores how to eat, right? One of the things I thought was interesting about the book was that you have a lot of books that are essentially books about how to eat, what to cook, how much of what to eat you should eat. And then there are some books, increasing in the past couple of years, right, that are about food production. Michael Pollan's books and Barbara Kingsolver wrote a book. And this book is sort of both. It's about how to translate some of the insights about how the food is made to what ends up on your plate.
Well, you know, to me it felt like I'd spent 25, even 30 years really talking about cooking, teaching people how to cook, thinking about cooking, developing a style, and then popularizing it to some extent. And then this feels more, although it has recipes, it feels more like it's bridging a gap into how to eat. And as you say, production, but also what the hell are we supposed to do? And I think that's a question that just about everybody who thinks about food is trying to answer. Where do we go from here? How do we make this work? If the system's broken, can we fix it?
Right. And can we?
Well, I mean, you think about this as much as me. I certainly don't have an answer. I do think that, when you and I were together a few months ago talking about policy, and I said I don't want to talk about policy because I don't know as much as you and other people who deal with policy every day or try to deal with policy every day, I started thinking about that, and I realized that I believe that people can create their own food policy, which is to say people can have an impact on what they eat, how they eat it, and how it affects them, and in a tiny way how it affects everybody else, and that's simply by choosing the right foods to eat. So Food Matters, in a nutshell, is about changing the proportion of food you eat, eating more plants and less of everything else, and specifically less of processed food, junk food, and industrially raised animal products, including meat and dairy, mostly meat and dairy. So the thing is that if people actually go and do that, and my guess is that the average American gets 80 or 90% of his or her calories from meat, processed food, and junk food, and 10 or 20% from unadulterated, unprocessed plant food. If that proportion is changed in any way, if the ratio is changed in any way, or that as long as it's in the positive direction, that's sort of a voting with your feet or voting with your mouth kind of thing, and it changes your life and it sets your tone for individual food policy, and that's where I'm headed in terms of a little bit of a fix. Now, I recognize that doesn't address huge issues. It doesn't address things on a mass scale. It addresses things on an individual scale. That's about as far as I can take it. But I'm really, I'm interested in continuing to explore with other people in this world what the answers, can this be fixed? I mean, that's your question. I'm sorry I don't have a straight answer for it. That's the best I can do right now. But I think that there is progress being made in fixing that, and that this is a conversation that needs to be happening among all of us all the time.
Well, one of the things I liked about the book, and I like about sort of the way this is coming to be seen, is that it really has an emphasis, I think, on changes as opposed to fixes. Right? So if you compare the way people are thinking about, say, eating meat and eating plants, and I think what used to be understood to be vegetarianism, which was an animal rights critique, at that point people were pretty much saying meat is murder, right? If you believe that killing a chicken is murder, then you can't eat any chickens because that would make you sort of a murderer. And I don't think I'm, that's very much the Peter Singer-esque position. It's not a position, incidentally, that I particularly disagree with. So I'm not trying to caricature it in any way. But I think that one of the innovations that you have in the book and that others have had as well is that if you're really worried about this stuff, particularly on the environmental level, but also on the animal rights level, the really important thing is not that a certain number of people become pure vegetarians, but that you actually simply lower the total number of particularly factory-produced meat consumed in the country.
Right.
And that the way you do that probably isn't getting some people to be very pure, but getting a lot of people to be a little bit better. And so you have rules not rules, but suggestions for ways of thinking about this. One that I used for some time, which was to eliminate meat from all meals before 6 p.m. And then more recently, I've gone to something where I just give myself 5 meat meals a month. And it's not pure, but it's a lot better than what I was doing before.
You've
and it's
stuck
better than
to
when
that,
I tried
yeah?
to be. Huh?
You've stuck to that.
I've stuck to that, yeah.
Good. Okay, just wondering. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No. I'm on track this month. I'm at like 3 or something.
Right. Yeah, well, there's a million ways. I mean, we're in total agreement here, and I think, my problem with vegetarianism is not only that it makes you sound like a hippie and it's crunchy and makes other people look at you weird, and obviously that's not as true as it was. There are many more vegetarians in our society, but that if you're interested in the impact on your own health and the impact on the environment, as you say, it's not vegetarianism that's important. It's reducing the amount of animal products that you're eating that's important. If you're really concerned with animal rights and animal welfare, if you think meat is murder, then vegetarianism is a bit hypocritical, because at that point, if the moral questions are the biggest ones for you, those ethical questions are the biggest ones for you, then veganism is really the consistent philosophy. Because, I mean, to me, if you're a vegetarian and you eat fish, it doesn't quite cut it. And if you're... Sorry, Ezra, hang on one second.
Go for it. We here at Blogging Heads will be taking a short break. Please stand by.
Okay. That was not the call. So I'll pick it up. I'll pick it up. To me, yeah. To me, if you're a vegetarian and you eat fish, it doesn't quite cut it. And also, if you're a vegetarian and you eat eggs, it's like, well, what happens to male chicks? We know what happens to male chicks, right? They're put through a paper shredder or something very much like it. And if you're a vegetarian and you eat dairy, what happens to male calves? I mean, these
interrupt
animals,
you for once.
Yeah.
To interrupt you for 1 second, I went to a goat cheese farm one time in Santa Cruz, which is very hippie-ish. And when we were there, she was talking about what happens to the male goats, and the woman who runs this beautiful farm, everything is, the water is all recycled, and the goats are treated unbelievably well. And she said that, somebody said, well, what about the male goats? And she says, well, they go into the meat industry. And I love the way she put that, right? Like, as if they turn 18 and they get a suit and a tie and a briefcase, and they get sent to learn the meat business. But no, I mean, they get, killed.
Right. They used to... There was a time, actually, in the United States where male calves were just killed and thrown in a pile and not even rendered or anything, just used for, I don't know what, compost. But now I'm sure they're used in some way. But the point is really not to trash vegetarians. The point is to say, as you say, if we get a huge number of people to eat less meat, and even if it's by 10 or 20%, that's a big number, because we kill 10 billion animals a year in this country for food. If we eat 10% less, that means we kill 1 billion animals less a year. That's a big number by any... I mean, It's no longer a big number of dollars, but it's a big number of animals. So, yeah, that's the idea. The idea is eat more plants and eat them at the expense of meat, animal products, and, of course, junk food and processed food, which is a whole other level of criminal activity.
And to make almost a follow-up point on this question of eating less animals, you'll hear occasionally some folks say, no, it's not that we need to eat fewer animals. We just need to buy them all from Neiman Ranch.
Right.
The Neiman Ranch people just did an op-ed. I think it was actually in your paper on this topic. And, you hear this from, a fair number of sustainable farmers. And, I mean, it's true on one level that, sustainably farmed stuff is somewhat sustainably raised livestock, is better than non-sustainably raised, but A, not by that much, and B, I think people really got to understand on this that when you're talking about making everything into essentially farmers market meat, you're talking about something much more radical than what even folks like you or I are really talking about. You're talking about jacking the price of meat up, 2 or 3 times probably, certainly more than 50%, which would radically decrease consumption. So that's really not, in the end, I think, that's not a scalable solution, right? It's a way individual people, I think, make themselves feel better, and it's fine, and it's something I I support. But I don't. The future, I think, which you argue well in the book, and is you can't be doing 10 billion, and as China and India come online to more meat consumption, more animals a year in a really sort of good to the animals, good to Mother Earth sort of way. It's too energy intensive. But at some point, we either need to trim consumption somewhat, or we're going to just sort of face the consequences of that. Well, but it's very hard to imagine that middle ground becoming something that everybody can actually stand on.
I don't think there is a middle ground. I think, of course, we want to raise animals in a sustainable and kind and humane and wonderful fashion, but to even begin to think about doing that, you probably have to think about cutting back meat consumption by 90%, or
right.
Maybe 80%. Who knows? But you can't raise 10 billion animals sustainably in this country. The math isn't there.
Much less worldwide.
Much less worldwide, and much less have people afford it. So That's all fine. I mean, if there were a law that, if I were czar of food and I could eliminate factory-raised animals tomorrow, I would, and I'd say, fine, let people eat sustainably raised meat, but that would mean that people were cutting their meat consumption by 90%, or since none of that is online in any kind of big way now, it would probably mean 98%, but whatever. So, yeah, that makes sense, but to say we can replace factory-raised meat with sustainably raised meat, no. We can replace a portion of it, and it's a very small portion.
Yeah, and it ends up, so you get this thing from the Neiman folks and from, these sort of farmers who will come up occasionally, good farmers, great, people who know a lot more about this, God knows, than I do, but who will say, we need to stop making this argument about meat. It's really about the way you raise meat.
Right.
And actually, I'm really on the other end of this, because if you want to make any dent, both in sort of most consumption patterns in this country, but also broader than that, you're going to really have to do what you did with cars, or frankly what you did on some level cigarettes, and just get people to at least agree that even if you're doing this, it has these effects. I drive a car. I mean, I don't smoke, but I'm in California and I drive a car. I have one out here. I don't drive it that often. But, I don't do it without being cognizant that, all right, well, I should try to cut back. I should try to do the measure, because these are just the trade-offs involved in me choosing this form of transportation. I think people do need to sort of just be willing to face up to, what it means when, what it sort of means when you eat meat. Well, and I find there's a lot of resistance to that, but...
it's interesting that you raise tobacco and cars and meat, because each of them has a different set of challenges, and each of them has a different set of solutions. Tobacco is clearly not a necessary thing to life, yet it's physically addicting, and there's no alternative. So that's one set of problems. Cars, transportation is essential, but cars aren't essential. But on the other hand, the alternatives to cars have not been well developed, so that's another set of issues. But processed food is essential, but meat, processed food, junk food, especially processed food and junk food, are totally not essential. In fact, they're deadly, and there are alternatives, that is, normally raised, normally cooked, normally eaten and handled food. I mean, let's just say pre-World War II kind of food. And yet, the question is, how do you demonize the food that's harmful for both people and the planet without sort of making people themselves feel demonized, and B, demonizing food, which we don't want to turn the country we don't want to turn ourselves into a population of bulimics here. We just want people to eat normal, real food. And that's the last thing is the issue that I find really difficult but very attractive too, which is this kind of, how do you start to demonize bad food the way that we demonized tobacco? How do you get the kids of 10 years from now to say to their parents, Mommy, Daddy, please give us real food, or please don't give us bad food anymore, the way they said to their parents, Mommy, Daddy, why are you smoking? We don't want you to die. I mean, that's... Right. How do we get to that? Where do we go in order to even start to get to that place?
So let me say one more thing on the meat thing, and then let's move to this, which is simply that one of the things that always strikes me about the cars and cows comparison is that you often get this from, city dwellers, I think, are much more intent on doing something about global warming and about cars than rural or suburban folk. And there's a good reason for that driving seems optional. But if you live in, Orange County and you work in Los Angeles, driving really isn't optional.
Right.
And, but it really is a case of choosing a hamburger or grilled cheese or a hamburger and whatever. people can make substitutions. A burger versus pasta for the night is not something you can't do if you live wherever.
Right.
And again, like I can hear this all coming out of my mouth, and I know how this dialogue, as we call them, will play. It's not going to do much for my non-liberal elite credentials, but this stuff is all, as far as I can tell, true. And it's sort of weird, right? I think it's very weird that the environmental movement is much more comfortable telling people, you can't use your car, even though you may need to, as opposed to it would be a really good idea if you, ate meat 2 fewer days a week.
Well,
and it's not that you have to change it. It's not that you have to. Nobody's passing a law, but just that, if this is what you're concerned about, I think it sort of is incumbent on folks to be sensitive to how much harder one is for people to do than the other.
Well, the car thing, I think the car thing has a 40-year head start here, a 35-year
No, I
head
think that's
start
right,
here.
too.
So, I was around in 1972, 1973 when we had the so-called energy crisis, the first energy crisis. And, it was pretty clear then that it was pretty clear, at least to people who could think a little bit into the future, that not all Americans were going to own their own personal car and drive it wherever they wanted forever.
Right.
But it's taken 30 or 40 years for us to even really start to make that kind of adjustment. So the food thing, 3 years ago, even I wasn't saying, but now I am saying this, even I wasn't saying not everybody can eat as much meat as they want to eat. It just became clear to me 2 or 3 years ago. So it's assuming that I'm at some kind of forefront at this thing, we have a long way to go.
So then that may be actually nicely into cigarettes. I was talking to Zeke Emanuel, who, very smart guy on this stuff. He's Rahm Emanuel's brother. He's a healthcare policy advisor at OMB, but really thinks hard about public health. And he makes a cigarette analogy a lot here. And he says that we are on food where we were cigarettes in the 1960s. And
right.
People are starting to get this message, but we're not anywhere. But it really gets into the public consciousness. But he also points out, in particular, two real problems, right? It isn't all that public attitudes changed. In part, public attitudes changed because policy became very aggressive.
Right.
You can't make people eat outside, and you shouldn't. It's going to be harder to demonize food than cigarettes because, in particular, cigarettes are one thing, right? You could say they're light cigarettes and they're black and milds and whatever, but in fact, they were all bad.
Yeah.
But when you begin, and we know that like an Oreo is worse than an apple, but there's an organic Oreo, and okay, well, where does that fit in? And there's, Wonder Bread. Is Wonder Bread really bad bread? Bread's pretty basic, ain't it? And it's going to be, I think, very hard because I think that that companies are very smart about getting ahead of this stuff.
Yes.
There's more organic items in the packaged food section than there is in the produce department in my supermarket. And I go to sort of a little ritzy, Harris Teeter. So that's going to be, I think, it's going to be very tricky. And I keep looking forward, and I just do not see the policy, interventions that work with cigarettes working here, making things much more expensive, being very clear on what's bad. I just think it's going to be very hard.
Suppose we're just playing. So suppose I propose to you that I could define what's bad as the amount of energy that goes into producing a given food. Maybe it's taxed proportionally to the amount of energy that goes into producing it. Because I can assure you that processed food, whether it's organic or not organic, in general takes a whole hell of a lot more energy to produce than an apple or than a head of broccoli or things like that.
My sense, and I don't have exactly the numbers here, so it's hard to say. I think that to ever make processed food of the type we're talking about economically problematic compared to fresh produce would require taxation of such a scale that it is nearly unmatchable. There are a couple exceptions here where you could do something very tightly defined, like soda, put a penny per ounce tax on it, and suddenly something like a 64-ounce soda would become, not unbelievably cheap, but I guess less than $1.27 or whatever it is,
right.
Or more than $1.27. But it is very hard for me to imagine moving that price curve at any level high enough to really to make that change. One of the interesting things, the places where I do think you see some level of opportunity, there's a good study that came out from David Cutler and a couple other economists, and they basically found the meals haven't gotten larger in the last 30 years. Dinner's gotten a bit smaller, breakfast and lunch a bit bigger, but that the rise in obesity is largely accounted for by snacking, that it's stuff we eat between meals. And a lot of snacking is about built environment stuff, you know? I mean, it's about whether or not it's easy to get a bag of chips while you're at the office.
Right.
You know, and employers, you know, the more they sort of get really convinced that they have a stake in healthcare costs, and the more some of this stuff comes out from the government, you could really imagine vending machines virtually disappearing. I mean, it is a choice an employer makes to put that in.
Apples and oranges.
I mean, I've heard there are problems with that because it's hard to keep them fresh. But yeah, so that sort of thing. But it's genuinely a choice an employer makes to put a vending machine in the hallway of the office, right? And you know, we used to have a Coke machine down the hall, and then we moved into what we call a swing space here. So I don't have a Coke machine down the hall, and I don't get Diet Cokes during the day anymore. Right. It's not like I'm willing to go down 6 flights of stairs and then walk out there in an elevator and walk down to the corner store for it. It's because it's easy. And the more we make it a little bit hard, I think that's where you're going to end up seeing gains, right? It is going to be quite the way it was with tobacco, where we actually put punitive elements into the items themselves. I think it'll be about reversing how easy it's become to attain the items. But if they're not as near, they're just harder. I think people eat less of them.
Certainly there's no argument with that, but sorry, I got distracted for a second. Certainly there's no argument with that. But if we just go back to the taxation thing for 1 second, it's not only about making taxes that make things prohibitively expensive, it's also about generating, part of the success of the tobacco campaign was that the taxes and the penalties on the tobacco company were used in part to educate people about the dangers of tobacco. So suppose you have taxes that then fund educational programs, which obviously are sorely lacking, about what constitutes a decent way to eat from now until the end of your life. Suppose you have, a fund that can provide what amounts to what we used to call home economics, where you teach kids their way around the kitchen, you teach kids what food is about, and so on. This is a long, if we're thinking a 30 or 40 or 50 year project here, then education's got to be a big part of it. It's not just making expensive soda cost $5 instead of $1. It's even if you make soda cost $1.50 instead of $1, the 50 cents can be put to good use.
Yeah, no, I think all that is absolutely true, and I think, hopefully over time we will do it. I would guess that we're going to have some type of soda tax within the next 5 years. That would be my hunch. You have it already in a number of states. It came into the national conversation during healthcare reform when I didn't expect it would ever show up there. I think that the ground is preparing for that very quickly, much more quickly than I would have anticipated. Right. I don't think it'll be big. I think it'll be enough to curb consumption a bit, and I think the money will go somewhere decent. I think something like that. I don't know how effective those programs will prove to be, but I think it'll be somewhat decent. But I think I've been pretty depressed by most of the interventions I've seen looking like that. I haven't seen a lot of really great results coming from any of that, and I think I've sort of ended up in this sort of arguably a little bit weird place where I think that the main thing you have to do is make snacks harder to get, because I don't think you're going to tax them that much to make them too expensive to get. And I don't really think one of the things is that I don't think people aren't terribly rational about this stuff, and I don't mean people as in not you and me, I mean you and me when we get in your potato chips. Right. That we just react to. It's all there in the neurologic in the medical studies. So I think you're going to need something where it works before you get to your food. Right?
Well, so does that mean the vending machine idea is a nice idea, but it's a small idea. Suppose along those lines, I guess this could be done on a municipality basis. You zone for fast food restaurants, so you only have one fast food restaurant per square whatever. Whatever makes sense, and you just make them harder to get to, and you make them less common. Is that the kind of thing you might be talking about?
I think you could see something like that. I seem to think the Ingleside or somewhere in LA tried to do Inglewood, that, and I don't remember what happened with it, but absolutely. And one thing that I think is encouraging here. I think we have a tendency to think about this in terms of very big meals, right? Like that it's about Big Macs and how do you get away from the Big Mac, and it's not. The change we need to reverse the entire obesity epidemic from the 70s is 150 calories a day. And that pretty much is what did it, too. It's not that people eat 4,000 calorie meals and they eat 1,000 calorie meals back then. It's, small increases sort of between meals and things of that nature. So we actually don't need to change the way people eat that much. We just do need to change it. That I think that we tend more naturally to think about this in terms of big changes in the way we eat as opposed to little changes. But the evidence I've seen, it does imply that little changes would be enough. And, to some degree that could be, you could go a little bit with that, oh, that's an average, and there are people on either side of the, curve, and they're eating way too much, and that's true. But, there's a lot that is captured in that average number, too. So, I mean, things like what you're saying there, zoning sort of away from fast food, or to put it differently, right, there are places where fast food can be. And it isn't right where, the schools are, where their homes are, where that it just makes it a little bit harder to get to. That you make, you begin to just, part of the effort here is that you just make it slightly harder to really make this food so unbelievably easy to get. Well, while other food is quite hard.
I mean, another start would be taking processed food out of school lunches.
Because, right, and that should be done.
Everybody says that 80% of the food that their kids are served in their schools is basically crap. So get rid of, change that.
Vending machines should just be out of, vending machines should be out of schools, and the processed food should be out of school lunches. And I just don't, there are things here where I really get where people get uncomfortable, right? Soda taxation. I really get why that makes people uncomfortable, and demonizing, certain types of foods. I get it. Getting Coke to stopping school districts from letting Coca-Cola sponsor them and getting vending machines out of schools, I really don't get. I mean, when you talk about not patronizing, but I'm sorry, I'm having aphasia here. What's the word for when the government paternalism? the thing about paternalism is it's implying you're treating people like children.
Right.
The people you should treat like children.
Right.
And they shouldn't be able to go down to the candy machine. And
right.
It just should be as simple as that. I mean, there are things that I think are rightfully controversial, and there are things that I think are insane that we haven't done. And getting vending machines and so forth out of the schools is in the insane that we haven't done it category.
I think it's insane that we haven't done something about making school lunches be decent also.
Right. I mean, and it's not that hard. I mean, one of the things about all that, you sometimes you'll have like Alice Waters explaining that everything needs to be fresh grown, and it would be nice. But you don't need great advances in cooking or even in sourcing to make school lunches less horrible. I mean, when I was growing up, my school lunch, Tuesday was fried chicken day, and Wednesday was pasta and meat sauce day, and it wouldn't have been hard to make that less terrible,
right.
Right. It just wouldn't have been hard, and it wouldn't cost a lot more, and, a lot of that money goes into the animal protein. If there was a bit less animal protein, a bit more other things, that would free up some money for the other things. I mean, you could do this in a number of ways, and it is simply not as if, these school lunches are suffering from giving kids too few calories. There is room to work with things.
Yeah, there is, and I don't think it is even an economic question. It's a policy question because, the animal protein is relatively expensive, so if you, God forbid, emphasize plant-based meals as opposed to meat-based meals, you change everything. And there's no reason that needs to be more expensive. There's nothing cheaper than rice and beans. I mean, I'm not saying you can give kids rice and beans every day, but,
Right, but yes, it's true that if Wednesday were red beans and rice day, like, nobody would be like, oh my God, how can you serve kids red beans and rice? And it would be an improvement from fried chicken day.
Right.
So,
right.
You really can. You can make these sort of small changes. And that to sort of move partially into this other topic too is the part I've been thinking about a lot lately. I've been doing this column that'll come out. I don't know if it'll come out by the time we have this talk up, but it's about sort of the behavioral economics of eating, and in particular, it's about this idea that one of the things that we found in behavioral economics is that people aren't terribly rational. But the good thing about that is that they're irrational in predictable settings, right? So people are irrational when they get around things that are free, or they are irrational when they are aroused, or they are irrational. You can go down the line. One of those times is with food.
Right.
And so one of the insights of this sort of look is that what you can do is you can set things up when you're rational to make life easier when you're irrational. You can plan for this. And so I called this guy Dan Ariely, who's the author of a book called Predictably Irrational. I asked him, how do you set up your Thanksgiving meal? And we talked about this for a little while, and the idea was not that you shouldn't overeat on Thanksgiving. And in general, you just should eat on Thanksgiving. We're sort of just using Thanksgiving to talk about overeating.
Right.
But the basic thing was you shouldn't try to put this on self-control, right? It's perfectly fine to say you're going to only have 2 servings of turkey when you're sitting here not having any turkey. But to do that, A, it's going to be it's going to be unpleasant for you to be worrying about all day, and B, it's probably not going to work. Just generally doesn't.
Right.
But what you can do is you can actually make it a little bit harder to access those calories. So, one of the very basic ideas, right, is you serve from the kitchen and not from the table. That actually, in theory, can actually do quite a bit. People, when you're sitting there talking to somebody and while you're talking, the other hand is moving, get more mashed potatoes.
Right.
Well, if the mashed potatoes weren't in arm's reach, maybe you wouldn't have gotten up to the kitchen at that time. People don't tend to like to go up and get second servings. It's why McDonald's has supersized meals and not just small fries where you can buy a lot of them.
Right.
Another big thing is the size of plates and bowls, right? There are tons of studies just showing that we don't tend to eat until we're full. We judge how whether or not we've eaten the right amount by how much is left on the plate. Smaller plates, people eat smaller amounts.
Right.
Not having a lot of snacking food. Dan Ariely, I occasionally go into further things. Chopsticks was one of his ideas, and I think more violently,
no utensils at all.
Right, exactly, and more violently, wear a very tight shirt on Thanksgiving, which I thought was a little bit of an unpleasant way to go about it. But I think it's an interesting way to think about this stuff, to think about eating less not as being a question of self-control, but a question of, setting up how easy it is to eat.
Right. Well, how do you set things up? How do you treat your daily life? I mean, I would argue that people should overeat on Thanksgiving because that's part of the tradition.
As would I, yes.
But
I mean, by the way, the question of whether or not you eat 6,000 or 4,000 calories just without even noticing it is not a meaningless question.
Right, it's not a meaningless question. But to get to the other behavioral stuff is, if they've always said don't go shopping when you're hungry, so that makes sense. Don't go shopping when you're hungry, so you don't buy impulsively the stuff that you wish you were eating right then. So have a good meal, go shopping. Go shopping with a list and buy a ton of vegetables. Then go home and put them in your refrigerator. Now you have no choice but to cook them, because otherwise you're going to throw them out because they're going to go bad. And if you organize your shopping trips so that you're buying the kinds of things that you want to be eating, the kinds of things that you should be eating, and then you go home and you actually cook them or prepare them in other ways, then those are the things that you're going to be eating. And that's an easy way, as you say, to plan rationally for how you're going to behave when your rational mind is out the window. Because if you then, cook yourself a meal of broccoli and pasta and a salad, that's what you're going to be eating. Whereas if you go by Budget Gourmet and you're throwing it in the microwave, well, then that's what you're going to be eating. So there's a zillion ways to plan even farther ahead than what size plates you use and whether you serve from the kitchen or not. It's really, what is it you have in the house that you're going to be cooking?
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. And to take this off of the Thanksgiving piece, it occurs to me that I wanted to ask you this anyway. So I just moved and I'm setting up my kitchen, right, and trying to think about this stuff, not really in terms of health so much as in terms of how do you best set up your kitchen to cook.
Right.
And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to not put things in the crisper drawers, right, down at the bottom where they just sort of, you can't see them.
I know. What is with the crisper drawers? It's completely ridiculous. You find things 3 weeks later and you say, damn, I wish I had cooked that.
Right. I once heard of a study. I haven't found it, but it was told to me by an economist, so I imagine he actually read it. And he did a study where, on the one hand, they subsidized fruits and vegetables by quite a bit with some of the people. And on the other hand, they put the fruits and vegetables on the same rack of the refrigerator where they put the beer. And the one where they put them on the rack of the refrigerator where they put the beer, much, much more effective in increasing the consumption of fruits and vegetables, as you would expect.
I'd like to see that study. That's very cool.
I would, too. I'm trying to look for it. If any of the people in Blogging Heads verse have seen it, I would love to get the actual copy. But there's a lot of little things, right? And to go further than that, actually, I'm finding I've been doing that, and it mainly works. But some radishes died the other day,
right?
And I was thinking of actually putting a little notepad on the fridge. Unfortunately, I don't have a magnetic fridge, but whatever. Where I write down the produce I have in there, just so I remember that I have it.
Right.
I honestly the biggest problem is I just find it hard to remember what in God's name I have in the kitchen.
Well, the other thing you can do is, I think not using the crisper drawer is a really good idea. Or maybe use the crisper drawer for beer.
I'm using it for beer and for beer and for cheese and things like that. Just stuff that.
But the other thing you can do is prepare stuff as you bring it home. So if you deal with the carrots, you deal with the celery, you deal with the lettuce, you deal with whatever, and it's prepared. This is what they've all. When I was writing about this kind of stuff 25 years ago, the nutritionists were all saying, cut up carrot sticks, cut up celery, make little melon balls, and your kids will eat them. Well, it's true. If you have this stuff prepared, not only will your kids eat them, you'll eat them. But if they're buried in a crisper and you don't see them, you're right. Yeah, they're going to turn into that weird slime.
Right, exactly, and that, you know, one of the other things I think is sort of interesting, which is, again, it's long been sort of a dietitian recommendation, but it's interesting to think about it as a matter of economics, right? Is to not have foods that, or to not have many foods at least that don't require preparation to eat, which is sort of the opposite of what we're saying there with the fruits and vegetables. That, you know, if you could just have a lot of stuff in there where when you walk by the kitchen, and I got a small place, I walk by the kitchen a lot, if I can just sort of reach in and grab some of Amy's pita chips.
Right.
Going to eat a lot more Amy's pita chips, you know, and like I'm not a guy with great self-control here, but so if I don't have them, I may want some Amy's pita chips, but I don't want them enough to walk out to the grocery store, buy myself a little bag of Amy's pita chips, and walk back home.
Well, that goes back to back to the strategy of thinking before you shop. I mean, if you have to say, okay, I know that if I buy, I mean, I never buy that stuff. I mean, literally. Never. I never have potato chips, pretzels, pita chips, tortilla chips. I never have that stuff in my house. And it's not because I don't like it. It's because if it's there, I eat it. And you just have to go to the store and say, I'm not buying this stuff. Or you say, look, I want some potato chips. I'm going to buy them. I'm going to eat them. That's it. But you don't buy 4 bags. You don't buy potato chips and pretzels and pita chips. And it's just a matter of you have to. You know, I was talking about this you know, food matters, sane eating, whatever you want to call it. Earlier today, I was on a panel, and she said, well, it can be very hard. And I said, yeah, it's a discipline. It's exactly a discipline. It's like running. It's like taking a shower. It's like anything. It's something you decide, I'm going to pay attention to my fitness. I'm going to pay attention to my hygiene. I'm going to pay attention to the clothes I wear. I'm going to pay attention to whatever. I'm going to pay attention to what I eat. I'm going to make some decisions, and they're firm decisions. They're negotiable, but, you know, this is the direction I'm moving in, and everything has to sort of move me, has to cooperate in moving me in that direction. The shopping, the cleaning, the cooking, the this, the that. It all has to, and the things that don't move me in that direction, that move me back towards the potato chip, burger, Coke eating person that I was or am or whatever, it's not off limits. I'm not never going there, but those things can't be part of the routine. They have to be the exceptions. These are the kinds of decisions humans can make.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's absolutely true. And right, and I think you do get into this thing where people, you always sort of want to, I don't know, what's the right way to put it, right? I guess I keep coming back to this thing that you have to decide which are the decisions you can and you want to make and which just sort of aren't. I think I've given up on the idea that if food is around me, I don't eat it. I'm just, you know, I'm pretty disciplined in a lot of ways, and I really, really, really have trouble with that.
Right.
So I have to make the decisions at a different time, you know. But it is sort of this, like, you know, knowing your own irrationality question. It's not that everybody needs to make the same decisions or do it in the same way. But I mean, it is.
No, absolutely.
I guess maybe part of the point is that I don't think people should have to think about it. I don't know that the best first order way to think about it is as a discipline, right? Because it isn't a huge discipline to do the stuff on the first level. The real hard discipline is when somebody's like, oh, and you can't ever eat ice cream when it's in front of you. If you make sort of the average meal like a little bit easier and you cut 50 calories out of it or whatever, well, the times when you sort of go off the reservation aren't going to be a very big deal.
Right.
You know, I mean, making those small changes is a lot easier than, you know, never allowing yourself real luxuries.
No, well, what I've said for the last year is that no particular ingredient, no particular meal, no particular day, week, even month matters that much if you see this as the big picture. I'm going to move my eating in a better direction. And it's as simple as that, and you have to generally act that way. I mean, you know, if you're eating meat 5 times a month, I can only assume you don't have beautiful salamis and prosciutto in your refrigerator waiting for one of those times to roll around, because if that stuff's around, you're going to eat it. It's the same. You know, if there's ice cream, you're going to eat it. If there's chips, you're going to eat it. We all like that stuff. There's no question.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I think, one of the interesting... That's why I think a lot of this is going to be hard in the long run, too, because one thing that I think that... It goes back to this question of, you know, how will we get kids to not want bad food? You're not going to, in my humble opinion. I think that I trust that the food researchers who have been spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on test groups and on laboratory studies and on chemical construction and all the rest of it, who have figured out how to make this food unbelievably what David Kessler likes to call hyper-palatable,
right,
that they've done a really good job. I mean, it isn't going to be that people don't want it. It isn't that, you know, well, I'm sort of I'm an elitist foodie, and, you know, I don't think a Egg McMuffin tastes good. I think a sausage egg McMuffin tastes like heaven.
I had one the other morning, in fact. But the English muffin
you
part
can't get
was
away
like,
from it.
The English
and you
muffin
shouldn't
was
deny
like
that.
rubber. It wasn't that great, but okay.
Oh, I like sausage McMuffins. They're a pleasure, but I haven't had one in a bit. But I do think that we're going to have to. I think you're not going to use a food metaphor here, have your cake and eat it too, as much as people might like, right? I think there's a tendency in sort of elite foodie circles to say that it's not simply that these are bad foods, but that they are on some sort of pleasure level bad. And if people just knew what it tasted like to have a consommé, they would never want McDonald's again. I don't think that's going to be the case. The question is going to be, you're going to have to work with people's palates, not work against them. Or work with your own and assume that it's representative.
But that's what we're saying. We're saying,
right? Yeah.
Fine, eat that stuff. Let it exist, but it has to be less of it. And as I've said, you eat more plants at the expense of that stuff, and you're doing well, even if it's small. And as you've said, even if it's in small changes.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is tricky about these conversations, and I find them hard to talk about because I can hear it coming out of my mouth, right, and think, my God, I sound like an absolute sort of, Santa Cruz bred coastal. And it's this funny thing because what we're talking about, right, it's not, the obesity questions, a lot of these don't hit very high income strata. They're fundamentally questions that are affecting poor communities and affecting them badly. It's a really bad thing to have diabetes, to have obesity, to have heart disease, and it's worse when you have to walk everywhere. It's worse when you don't have good access to medical care. And it is interesting that you have a lot of these questions where their actual effect of solving them would be wildly progressive, but they've been sort of framed as incredibly elitist, right? As if sort of like what's actually being seen here, what people want to do is impose affluent lifestyle preferences further on down the income line, as opposed to, try to help you, figure out a way that we don't have what we are projected to have now, which is, around a quarter of the child population having type 2 diabetes, which is a really unprecedented and for them a really horrible thing.
Right.
But so it's very hard to get this into language where you don't just sort of sound like you're saying, well, people should eat like me. And I don't know that people have really figured out a good way of communicating this. I know I haven't, but it is, I think, one of the real problems. It is surmountable, but will have to be surmounted, right? We're going to have to get to somewhere where you can talk about this in a less sort of charged way, where people don't feel it's about lifestyle, but are willing to recognize that it is, like anything else, a policy problem. People don't like all of my prescriptions on healthcare reform, but they don't necessarily think that I'm doing it because I really love Kaiser Permanente, and I think everybody should do Kaiser Permanente because I do it. But you do get that when you're talking about, say, eating less meat.
Right. Well, we're working on the communication stuff. It's not a quick fix, clearly.
Yeah. It's true. But I guess with that, happy Thanksgiving.
Make sure you overeat.
And yeah, it's good to talk to you, Mark.
Same here. It's been fun.
As always. All right, thank you.
Okay, take care.